Hi guys, this is the talk that I did a couple of evenings ago on VO2 Max and how to get the best out of your training and how to look at some of the data. Obviously, these are some of the things that I'd be looking for in your training and in your data afterwards. And some of the prompts that I would give you and have been giving you on the sessions is some of the reasoning behind it, hopefully on this little talk today. Unfortunately, the session that I did the other evening didn't record, or at least I can't locate it on the laptop. So I'm re-recording it this evening and we'll post it on YouTube a bit later. So we've undertaken a couple of sessions on VO2 Max, and I've fed back to each of you about the benefits and how perhaps to just tweak your next VO2 Max session to get the utmost out of the time that you're spending exercising at a very difficult level. So we'll move on. We'll start with a little bit of science, the background to it, and then hopefully we'll look at some of the data that we've gathered this week, and then how we can use that over the next 3 weeks to maximize the gains. Okay. So the basic principles behind VO2 Max is that the muscles really are the crucial factor to begin with, because they demand oxygen, and it's their demand and use of the oxygen that drives the rest of the adaptations to the exercise that we're doing. So basically, by using our muscle cells, they need oxygen. Obviously, they do have some anaerobic capacity, but eventually they need oxygen to continue to exercise. So they take oxygen from the blood, and this is obviously delivered in arteries. And then on the other side, the deoxygenated blood, the blood that's lost its oxygen to the muscle, is then taken back to the heart and then onto the lungs to be refilled with oxygen again. Now, luckily, and as an adaptive thing, we've got sense receptors that tell us whether we've got a lack of oxygen in the veins and how much is being used by the muscles, and therefore we upregulate the delivery of that oxygen, and obviously we'll start to breathe a little bit more quickly, and our heart will start to pump a little bit quicker, and also increase the amount of blood that it pumps per beat as well. So that's the crucial part, really, is that we are controlling the muscles. That's the bit that we can control in this. We can decide how much power to push on the pedals or how quickly to run. And we can decide, the cadence and how quickly we spin the legs, or how quickly we move the legs when we're running. We can't necessarily increase our breathing rate voluntarily. And I know we can short term, and we can't really increase our heart rate voluntarily, but they will pick up once we've demanded more oxygen. Now, most of the oxygen that gets into our lungs, the oxygen that we need just sort of naturally dissociates across into the capillaries and then to be taken around the body. So actually breathing more and more doesn't increase past a certain point, and we're getting all the oxygen actually into the blood that we need. The real crux of the matter is how quickly we can get that blood that's full of oxygen to the working muscles. So as I'm sort of alluding to now, the crucial organ in this maximal oxygen delivery is the heart. And as I said before, obviously the thing that we notice quite commonly is that heart rate goes up. So, your resting heart rate might be very low at 50 or something like that. When we start to warm up, it'll be in the low hundreds perhaps. And then we know our maximum might be up in the, depending on your age or whatever, it might be in the 170s or even higher. So we've got all that room for improvement to deliver more blood. The thing that we don't necessarily see is the increase in blood that is pumped for every beat of the heart. So the heart muscle is capable of stretching both within an individual session and over time. And this is known as stroke volume, or SV. That's the amount of blood that your heart can pump in one beat. Obviously, the bigger the chambers and the more adaptable it is to the stretch, then you can pump more blood per each beat. So if you get that happening alongside with more beats per minute, then we can deliver a hell of a lot more oxygen to our working muscles. And when we hit the maximum oxygen delivery, that's said to be VO2 max. So when we do any form of exercise where we hit that point, then that's said to be VO2 max, or the volume of oxygen that's delivered maximally. Okay. So We don't really know, unfortunately, when we are exercising at VO2 max. It's a little bit of an educated guess unless we're in a laboratory setting. But there are some things we can focus on when we're doing our intervals to try to ensure that we're getting close or perhaps hitting VO2 max during the session. So the first thing to say is that we need to focus on high effort levels. These need to be maximal efforts, starting maybe at a 9 or 9.5 out of 10 and getting to a 10 out of 10 effort. But that effort needs to be for the duration of the whole interval. So typically, your VO2 sessions would be 3 minutes long. Each interval would last 3 minutes. So when I say maximal effort, I mean for the duration of the 3 minutes, not simply going as hard as you can in a sprinting like fashion and finish at 90 seconds. And then your power drops off massively and you kind of crawl to the end of the 3 minute interval. So it's maximal effort, but it's maximal knowing that you've got 3 minutes to hold it for and that you've got maybe 5 or 6 repetitions to do. And obviously this means there is a bit of practice that's needed in this to get it just about right. And that's where, again, looking at your data afterwards can help you. The feelings or the way that it feels to you is it should feel like a 10 out of 10 effort really by the time you've finished. And you should be gasping for breath at the end of an interval. You're really, really struggling to breathe. And that's what makes them difficult to tolerate and mentally makes most people a little bit anxious about having to do these sorts of intervals. We do expect to get a very high heart rate. It may not hit absolute maximum. And there will be a lag at the start of each interval. It will take 30 seconds, probably minimum. During the latter intervals, it would probably take about 30 seconds to really spike heart rate. In the first few intervals, it could take 60 to 90 seconds easily to get up to the sort of heart rates that we really want. But then the back end of each interval should be right up at a very high heart rate. High cadence is optimal. Again, we can produce power by using a bigger gear, but it's optimal to use the slow twitch fibers in the muscles because these are the ones that really need oxygen. So they will call for more and more oxygen as they work more aerobically and less anaerobically. So higher cadences are better, something in the region of 90 to 100 revs per minute, really. If we drop it much below that, particularly down into the 70s, then we're using a lot more fast twitch muscle fibers, which are capable of producing power, but they do it from a more anaerobic means. So they're not likely to call for such amount of oxygen. And therefore your heart rate response might be a little bit blunted. You might not really hit the very, very high heart rates, even though you're hitting the power levels. So again, we said the key adaptation is the heart, and I won't go into that any further, but it's about the volume of blood returning to the heart, which stretches the heart. So I often say that it's a little bit like doing plyometrics. You can jump higher if you do a little bounce or you drop off a little block and then jump, rather than if you just jump from the floor as a one-off effort. And that pre-stretch of the heart increases the amount of blood within it and allows it to stretch more and therefore get stronger. So just like working any muscle, your heart muscle can get stronger and it can also become bigger. And they're the benefits that we really want to strive for with VO2 max training. There are some differences between novice and advanced athletes. In more novice athletes or those who are more anaerobically sort of trained or gifted rather than aerobically, the stroke volume adaptations, so that the amount of blood that the heart can pump, increase up until a certain level, but that's often way below max heart rate. And then from that point on, the heart rate increases, but the actual amount of blood that's able to fill and then be pumped from the heart just sort of stagnates or sort of plateaus off at an earlier rate. So that means that novices may not have to hit absolute near maximum heart rates to still achieve very good stretch of the heart and improvements in the heart muscle. However, for advanced athletes, numerous research studies have shown that stroke volume is able to keep increasing right up until maximum heart rates, very, very near the top. So if you are very well aerobically trained, consider yourself, very, very well trained or advanced in your level of triathlon or running or cycling, for instance, then you probably need to be hitting, in the region of 95% of max heart rate or something like that, which I'll come back to in a little detail later. So if I was looking at, to analyze a VO2 max session and to see how it had gone, obviously the obvious thing is to look at power, but we do tend to be a little bit overly concerned with power in most of the sessions that we do. Particularly for VO2 max, as I've sort of alluded to earlier, power certainly needs to be high, but it doesn't need to be at a certain percentage of VO2 max or the very top of VO2 max for every single interval. And again, I'll hopefully explain that in a little bit more detail later. So power is certainly one thing. Again, the comments from the athletes would need to be that it was near max effort or max effort, certainly as they get more confident at this. So the RPE would want to be around 9 or 10 out of 10 by the time they've finished. And even really by the time they start, it needs to be right up at that very high level. The metrics that we'd look at, we're looking at heart rate. Again, there will be a little lag, but we're looking for it to get really quite high, well above threshold heart rate. And again, I'll mention that a little bit later. And the cadence, again, ideal cadence would be in the 90s and maybe around 100 if you're very efficient at cycling and used to pedaling at that high level. Obviously, we wouldn't want cadence to be prioritized so much that power drops off massively. So it's really about finding a sweet spot between these metrics. So we're getting the combination of high effort, high power, high heart rate, and high cadence in the athletes that do this session. So here's an example from a 5x3 session that I did a couple of weeks ago. So as you can see, I started off a little bit above target power, as you can see from the purple power trace. And then in each interval after that, it drops a little. So the first two are probably just above target power. The third one probably looks like it's about target power. And then, although starting really quite well on 4, it starts to drop off as, fatigue sets in, etc. And then on number 5, it's consistently really below target power. And I measured the drop off here as about 8% from the very best effort at the beginning to the least effort on number 5. Just ignore the effort number 6 that's on the far side at the moment. I can mention that a little bit later. So if you looked at it purely from a power point of view, you might say I didn't pace it that well. Maybe I went out too hard in the first 2 intervals and paid for it later on. I'm going to explain in a little while why I actually think that is a good thing, and that's something that I actively tried to do on the session. You can obviously see on rep 4 that I was struggling from sort of a minute in. It's a 2-minute gradual downward trajectory of the power, which shows obviously the struggle. I wasn't doing that on purpose. That was me pedaling as hard as I could. But again, I wasn't worried about that. And again, I'll explain that in a second. So looking at it purely from a power perspective, you might look at that and think, a little bit disappointed. However, I'll move on to the other metrics now just to show those as well. So this was the cadence data. So again, I wasn't able to keep it in one gear for the entirety. One gear just didn't feel quite right. So, up to 103 revs to keep the power high. They're the spikes. And then, occasionally I was changing down one gear, and that was allowing me to produce the power at about 96 revs per minute. And those are the plateaus that you can see. And so the little jumps in cadence are where I wasn't quite happy with the pedaling, and I was changing cadence a little bit to try to keep on top of the power. And again, that's okay. We risk, slipping a chain or having some problems with the drivetrain if we're maximally pedaling and trying to change gear at the same time. But it's less of an issue normally with the rear cassette rather than the front chain rings. So those are the little blips, but generally it was in the high 90s for the entirety of the efforts. So happy with that. And then looking at the heart rate data, I've highlighted the threshold line, which is the dotted line, and I've highlighted, I've added to the chart my max heart rate that I see commonly on races or interval efforts. So you can see at the beginning, heart rate just takes a little while to come up on that first interval. The initial spike in heart rate isn't very steep, it's moderately steep. And as it gets just past threshold, there's a bit more of a plateau to it. It does continue to rise just about to the end of interval 1, but it's categorized really by a sharp incline at the beginning and a more moderate sort of plateau through the rest of the interval. Now, this interval session of 5x3 had lesser recovery. So the first recovery, designed to really keep heart rate elevated and allow it to spike more quickly on the second interval, was 2 minutes. We then had the next 2 interval recoveries at 2:30 and the final one at 2:45, which is a little bit less than you would commonly have on VO2 max sessions, where the normal 1-to-1 ratio of say 3 minutes work to 3 minutes recovery. But again, to maximize heart rate response, I wanted to keep those interval recoveries just a little bit lower, but still allow some time for heart rate to recover, mentally for people to recover and be able to hit the next effort. So it's very much a balancing act. So you can see that heart rate comes down reasonably well after interval 1. And then on interval 2 and the subsequent intervals, you can see how it spikes up much more quickly. So we've got a much quicker rise to get above the threshold heart rate again. And again, on interval 2, the maximal heart rate of that interval is a few beats higher than it was on interval 1. So really, this is almost like interval 1, although the power was the strongest, as we saw before, the heart rate response is the least. And as we've built up that deficit and used quite a lot of anaerobic energy in interval 1 that hasn't been fully restored for interval 2 and then subsequently, then we're getting a better heart rate response. So really the best intervals from the heart rate perspective are 2, 3 and 4. Now, I don't quite hit maximal heart rate at any one point, and that's probably because I'm always looking to the next interval and I'm not quite fully emptying the tank. You know, if on any of those intervals somebody held a gun to my head, I'd probably have a 10 to 20 second sprint that I could add on top, and that would probably take me up to my absolute max heart rate. However, it's well above threshold. And actually, for the majority of these intervals, you can see the plateaus of heart rate indicate that it's around about 95% and above for the majority of each interval. So we've got 15 minutes of intervals and let's say probably 12 minutes of actual high heart rate for those 15 minutes. Obviously, remembering that heart rate takes probably 20 to 30 seconds to come back down under threshold at the end of each interval. So although we've stopped pedaling largely, you're still getting benefits at the heart muscle for another 10, 20 or even 30 seconds after the end of that 3-minute interval. And then I won't again explain the last interval, but you can see I added a number 6 interval there. And although it was of lower power, which I'll mention later, I still got a decent heart rate response and something that I'll discuss a little bit later on. So that's the heart rate. And again, that was what I was looking for. I thought that would be a good response from the training. So looking at heart rate zones, zone 5C under the Friel zones that we commonly use for cycling is your top heart rate zone based on your threshold heart rate. And for me, it lies around about 170 to 171. I've marked it now on the screen with the red bar, and you can see on interval 1 that I just about get to 170 as it plateaus. So again, not quite as high as I would like, but accepting it because I overdid the power and it just did what it did. It wasn't quite long enough of an interval to really get up into this area that I would like it to be for the full benefits of this type of workout. But then on subsequent intervals from about here, we go into this zone here. And again, we stay in it a little bit after the interval. Same again here, we've got all this time really working the heart very well. And again, some elongated time in the zone here. And similarly on each interval, you can see the same pattern. Now, after a 3-minute rest here at the end, it was a cool down. However, what I wanted to see was if I did just one more interval, but kept the power at threshold. So now we've got quite a big drop off in power from the first 4 intervals to the first 5 intervals to the 6th interval. And here we've got an interval at threshold power, but actually because of the accumulative fatigue from the first intervals, we've got a slightly slower rise, but we're still hitting maybe 1 minute's worth of work in interval 6 that's really up in the quality end of what we were looking for. So this is again to say that maybe even adding a 6th interval could be of use when we're looking at it from heart rate response point of view. Again, you would look at the power and think, well, what's the point? Because it's well below VO2 max power. But again, this might be a reason that we need to keep exercising maximally. You know, maximum effort is probably more important than maximum power. So if on any given day you're not quite feeling that you've got the max power that you normally have, it may well still be worth completing the session because we don't truly know when we hit VO2 max within our body. So some other metrics that I would look at when analysing athletes' efforts, we've got the first 2 here, intensity factor and normalised power, which are both power metrics related to threshold power here. So the top end of VO2 max power is 1.2. So first interval, as we said, was a little bit high. Second one's average bang on the top of VO2 max power. Then we're dropping to 118, then 116, and then 1.1. Again, the lower end of VO2 max is 1.5 or 105% of your threshold. So we're still well within VO2 max power, but it's definitely a decreasing trend. And you can see that from the power numbers: 408, 401, 394, 388. And then the last one, quite a big drop off here of about 17 watts. So that's the power profile. But interestingly, as you'd expect, we've got heart rate maxing out at 170 on number one. Then we're getting to 173, 174, and 175 around there. So even though power is dropping, heart rate is still responding harder and harder. The effort level is certainly not dropping, even though power is getting more difficult. And again, just to highlight the cadence, averaging in the mid to high 90s, and obviously just tending to fatigue a little bit towards the end, perhaps favoring slightly lower lower cadence as I'm losing that power. So what we're seeing here basically is power. This is another athlete's data. So again, mimicking my sort of approach to the session. Bit of a spike in power at the start of each interval, really, where the athlete tries to get up and on top of the speed or the power. Same here, a little bit less on 3. Nice big start or big start to 4. And again, a little bit of a positive start to number 5. The trend of power through each interval is to drop a little bit. And overall, there's more power here in number 1 than there is in number 5. But again, what this does by doing it in this way is we get this steep curve and a plateau at the top. So this data looks different, probably different numbers to mine, but similar pattern. So that's another example of that same pattern. Now, I think these 3 data sets taken from some of my other athletes highlight people who are either a little bit new to this, who have focused on the power a little bit more rather than truly going maximum. They've tried to use the target power number and stick to that as a very good guide. If we look at the top one, you can see here's the power target. We're fluctuating a bit, but the average of each of these, and they get better, don't they? They get much more closer to the average as the athlete feels their way into it. So we've got an initial spike, but then we've got very average, sort of very well modified power relative to the target. Number 2 looks like it's more like an erg mode trace, or there is a little bit of variability here. There's very little even compared to this one. And then on the final one, same again, we've got a little bit of overshoot, but it's very close to target power in the whole. Now, the reason that I don't think this is optimal, even though you would analyze the data afterwards and just looking at power, you would think it was really good, consistent, is that we never get to heart rate plateau point. The heart has always got more to give. You see, so interval 1, still rising. Interval 2, still rising. Interval 3, still rising. Interval 4, again, there's just very little. There is some here maybe, but there's very little sign of the heart getting to near its maximal, because we're not plateauing in heart rate. Same here. They're all upward trajectories in the main. We're getting a little bit more plateau towards the end, but we really want to see this much earlier on. Same here. Everyone is still on a fairly steep upward curve. We're not reaching that plateau by the end of the interval. So that's my take on those traces, really. So that's probably somebody executing it really well from a power perspective. And all these were hitting this at the ideal cadence. So cadence wasn't an issue, but I think they had more to give and could have tweaked the way that they hit the intervals based on target power and going above it maybe, and actually truly working maximally rather than just hitting the target power. That would have worked out with a better heart rate response. This was one that was done on erg mode. You can see very flat power traces. And again, here, the problem with erg mode, I think, was that although this athlete was starting out at relatively high cadence, as can be seen by the yellow line, we're getting through as the power built, as the resistance on the erg builds through each effort, we're getting significant drops in cadence. And again, these were starting off in the high 90s, but on some of the lower ones, we're hitting about 70 to finish the interval. So it's just not ideal. And here we can see some plateau of heart rate, but it's because we're not really demanding the oxygen, because we're not hitting maximal effort, and we're using a bigger gear with lower cadence. We're never really actually demanding the heart to continue to raise the pulse rate and the stroke volume. So that's my take on that one, which was erg mode. And then one of the very tricky ones is with the more anaerobic athletes who can go very hard for short periods of time, but their anaerobic development is really stunting their aerobic growth. And this is two examples, I think, of athletes who have this sort of nature to be very good anaerobically, but not so good aerobically. And what I think you can see here is these from interval 3 here and right from the start here on the second trace, is we get this significant drop off in power, which is very abrupt. So it's not a gradual drop like we maybe see on intervals 1 and 2 here. We're getting a very much what seems like the end of the athlete's anaerobic capacity. And again, here, it might also be a mental thing because this seems to occur bang on the middle of these intervals pretty much. So it's occurring about 90 seconds in. But it might be that here they're restoring a reasonable amount of anaerobic capacity, but not enough to get them through the next interval. And because the aerobic system isn't well maintained to maintain a really good power, they get this real drop off in power at that limit of anaerobic capacity. Now, this athlete is obviously going out hard at the beginning. They are giving it their all, but after the first 6 minutes of effort, they've not got the aerobic system to back them up, I don't think. What was interesting with the top one is this plateau here that occurs in the second half of each interval is pretty much exactly at critical power. And critical power is defined by being the highest aerobically achievable power level. So what's happening again, what I think it's giving me evidence of is this is anaerobic contribution, this bit above. Once that runs out, this is what they've got aerobically, which is obviously way below the target power. So this is a tricky one, but that's what I think I'm seeing in the top graph. In the bottom one, again, this is an anaerobic athlete as far as I'm concerned, but here they just set out at way too far above target power. If this is up near 120% of the FTP, this is already on the border of VO2 max and pure anaerobic work. Now, they went out here in this one. I think this was about a 160 target, and this is 200. So each of these are 200 as a start point. Now, again, this is an athlete going maximum. And because they've got good anaerobic capability, they're holding it for, say, 90 seconds and maybe 60 seconds later on. So they are going maximum, which is kind of what you're asking. I think the difficulty here is with the interpretation. It needs to be maximum, but with the ability to hold it somewhere near for the entire 3 minutes or whatever the block of VO2 max is. So here, we would obviously want to temper this down and maybe just start to aim for just above or bang on that target power and see if they can stretch it to the full 3 minutes. And not only the full 3 minutes, but the full 3 minutes of each consecutive interval. You can see here, it drops really, really quite low. So this would have been an incredibly difficult workout to do, to try to hold on to power after starting this higher. And that, they managed to do it for 3 reps, really. They're still at target power here. But on 4 and 5, they obviously really, really start to sort of fall apart. And we can help that athlete to get more from their VO2 max work by just, giving good feedback and giving them maybe, we can change interval lengths and stuff, but I won't go into that. So that's the more anaerobic athlete, which is a little bit more rare amongst triathletes, but it's certainly quite common within total tri training. We've got plenty of athletes who fall into this makeup. And then I've got quite a few athletes who are just quite new to VO2 max work. And I've looked at the data afterwards and I just think, yep, you've done really, really well. But there are signs that you can go harder and that this isn't truly a maximal effort. So I can give them confidence next time that you can start a bit harder. You can probably hold on to a bit more power than you did today. And the thing that I found on this one was, if you look at the power that they reached, actually intervals 1 and 5 were the highest, with 2, 3, and 4 being the slightly low ones, particularly 3 and 4, which notoriously are difficult mentally because we're not now near the beginning and feeling fresh, and we're not quite near the end. So 3 and 4 can be quite difficult. But I think if your interval 5 is almost as good as 1, you're not truly going near max in number 1. So I would give this athlete a bit of confidence, maybe to start the same or to start even a little touch higher, but certainly in the middle to hang tough. They should be able to hang a little bit tougher in those middle intervals, I think. And then again, another sort of sign of that is reps 1 and 5 here are equal in power. I've not included the figures, but you'll have to believe me that this repetition here is the same average power as this one. So that's similar to before. And here we've actually got the highest power is 2 and 3. So you can see by the clear space under the chart here, under the target, is that this is larger than 1. And again, this isn't quite as high as 2, but 2 and 3 were the highest power levels. Now that means that number 1 next time can be a bit higher, and we're still not dropping off very much towards the end. So this is a great session, but I think we can even front load the session a little bit more next time. Again, here we've got an athlete testing the water. They're already above target power, but then intervals 2 and 3 go bigger and bigger. They're growing in confidence, perhaps. They're realizing they can give a little bit more. Now, obviously, on 3, they may have gone a little bit too deep, because then on 4, it comes back down, but we're still above target. And here, this is still above target, although there's a little dip in the middle. And we interestingly, like most people, we have that little bit of extra come the end of the session here at the end of interval 5. So again, I would be, advising this athlete that yes, they did this very, very well, but there is a little more in the tank, and I would actually like them to swap these first 3 intervals round, if anything, and go this hard in interval 1 to really get that heart rate response going. And then interval 2 and interval 3, they might drop a little bit, but we'd probably get an overall slight improvement in heart rate response to the session. Again, this one I think is just kind of a novice trace. We can see that they hit and slightly exceed the power in number 1. Number 2 is a little bit similar. Number 3 is growing. And then 4 and 5, I think they realize actually this isn't quite as difficult as maybe I thought it was or thought it should be. And they've really put the hammer down on the last 2. Now, obviously, we can give them a lot of confidence that next time they can go harder, because 4 and 5 are much, much stronger than the first 3. And then when analysing the data, a little bit of interesting feedback from athletes and looking at every one of those data points was that I think we just need to be careful when we're analysing heart rate as to how we've got the zones set up. I was giving feedback that we wanted high heart rate, and as a rough guide, we probably want to try to maximise time around about 95% of max heart rate or above, and that's similar to a lactate threshold heart rate of 105% or above, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. However, that means that the data that you've got set in Training Peaks as setting the athlete zones needs to be correct. So this is one of my athletes' data charts on the left with their bike zones for heart rate, and it's my zones on the right-hand side. So if you look on the left, I think what we've done here from memory was that we've set up this athlete zones from one of the personal best performances, a test on Zwift, a group session, or a race or such. And so they've probably been tapered going into it. They've had a personal best performance. They might well have been dosed up on caffeine and other performance enhancing supplements for the race to get the most out of it. And they've undoubtedly had a very good race on that day. The problem with using a personal best to then set those threshold heart rate zones is that it might not represent what they do on an average week. So we just need to be a little bit cautious with that. So here we've set threshold heart rate at 168, which is obviously the average heart rate they sustained on race day. But the maximum heart rate they ever really hit is 179. And then if we look down at the zones where I spent a lot of time in zone 5C on my data that I showed you right back up at the beginning of the session, you can see that the start of 5C for this athlete is actually bang on their max heart rate. So if we were to analyze it based on threshold heart rate, they would never be able to achieve any time in zone 5C. So the cautionary note here would be that this athlete could sort of triangulate that by saying, okay, well, if I can't get to 105% of lactate threshold heart rate, if my max is accurate and I come down to 95% of that, so they would probably take 8 beats or 9 beats off that. So again, they're looking similar to myself at about a 170 sort of break point, and that's achievable. But if we go down to 170, that's only just above threshold. So when you look at it that way, it wouldn't quite look right when you're looking at the data. I think for this athlete, probably what is needed is that we look at what the threshold heart rate is over a longer period of time, when they're in the middle of training blocks and they're doing some training races or they're doing some hard sessions. And I would expect that they typically see threshold heart rates in the region of sort of 162, 164, that sort of beats per minute. So that's a cautionary note there. And that's what I've done, obviously, with my data, with being able to look over mine and understand my body a little bit more as a personal thing. 162 is my kind of realistic threshold heart rate, although in a personal best performance, it's been 169. Similarly, max heart rate, I've occasionally seen a 180. But 176 seems very, very common at the end of a team time trial or the end of a hard threshold session or something like that. So I know that those are not my very, very best numbers, but they are probably realistic for training too. And so that brings me out with that 5C number of about 170, 171. So that's my kind of goal for these VO2 max sessions, is to gain as much time out of the 15 minutes or whatever we decide upon at around that number or a little bit above. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more to think about with heart rates as well. When we're using it as an analysis tool, we've got to get the data somewhat right at the beginning. And then to finish, really, what I just wanted to say is that, success or failure, it's not determined just by watts alone. We get very much carried away with power. And particularly using Zwift and the online platforms, the way that we compare ourselves to everybody's watts and watts per kilogram. As far as VO2 max training is concerned, we can hit the power, but we might not get the full reward for our effort. And that's why I've gone into a lot of detail as to how I think we can tweak the intervals to get the maximal response from them. So effort level is rewarded. So even on any given day, if you can't quite hit the numbers that you normally hit, and you might be 10 watts low or such, you might still be hitting VO2 max or very close to it if you just give what is 100% for your evening or day's worth of work. So the first thing is make sure you give it maximal effort and don't be too hung up on the watts. We can control the cadence. We can control the effort level. So they're the things to focus on. Power hopefully will come. But if it doesn't, then not to worry about it too much. And then the most important factors really is, apart from the maximal effort, over the full duration of the interval, not like the first 50% or first 1 minute, is to try to maximize that consistently high heart rate for as many minutes as possible. Now, again, this is more important for the advanced athletes, where we know that the heart is stretching and adapting right up until you get to maximum heart rates. For the novices amongst you that might be listening to this, don't stress too much about it. If it's your best effort for 3 minutes, and then next time it's your best effort for 3 minutes, and similarly right throughout for the 5 sessions or 6 sessions, then that's absolutely fine. That's what we're wanting. And then cadence, ideally, to make sure we're maximizing the recruitment of slow twitch muscle fibers, we want it above 90, and maybe around about 100 would be ideal. But work towards that. Again, if you can't quite hit those numbers, just be mindful that that's a goal you can work towards. And then you would progress these. I've not really mentioned this, but if you've done this for a couple of weeks and you're going to extend it a little bit longer, you would want to progress the time in zone. So what we want to do is change it from 5x3 to 6x3, maybe getting as high as 7x3. There's nothing wrong with 4s. There's nothing wrong with the odd 5-minute interval. And different ways of doing it can suit different people in different ways. So it's something that you can experiment with just a little bit. And then the other way of doing it that we've started to do and is written about as well is the microburst intervals. The philosophy behind that and the way they work is a little bit different. It is more about, for me anyway, it's a bit more about the power rather than the heart response and the cadence. And I won't really include those in what I've been talking about tonight. So hopefully that sums up what I'd like to talk about as far as VO2 max is concerned, and hopefully that's been of interest to you. Obviously, if your data's included, you'll have had feedback this week to the effect of what I've already talked about, but hopefully by listening to this and taking a little bit of time to look through your own data, it will help firm up what the idea of these really, really hard sessions is. And to finish, I'd just like to say that make sure the rest of the week is totally polarized. This is the 20% or so of really, really hard work. The rest of the week can be lower zone 2. It only needs to be nice, easy, endurance style training, and we'll still benefit from these sessions. They are massively difficult, both physically and mentally. So don't underestimate them, and feel free to keep the rest of your week's training nice and easy as you hit these 1 or 2 really, really key sessions in the week. Okay, hope that helps. Cheers.